All right, thanks everyone. Once again, this is a joint event from Argon Intellect and RS Squared. Check out the booth if you want to know more about Argon Intellect and these sessions being run frequently every week. I'm Asan, your host. Our next talk will be from Jenny Liu, Graph Normalization Flows. Let's thank the speaker and have her start.
All right, so today I'm going to be talking about graph normalizing flows, and this is joint work with several other people, Avril Kumar, Jimmy Ba, Jamie Kiros, and Kevin Swirsky. So there's this problem in machine learning of graph generation, and it's basically you have some set of graphs. So for example, you might have the two community graphs on the left here, or the protein graphs on the right. And given this set of graphs, you want to generate more graphs that look like they came from this set of graphs. So you want to generate similar looking graphs. And you can imagine that this has lots of useful applications in, say, drug discovery. So maybe you have this distribution over molecules that you know to be very useful as drugs. And now you want to figure out new candidates to test, and testing is kind of expensive. So to generate these candidates, you might say, I'm going to look at my current distribution of useful drugs that I know and try and generate molecules that look like these drugs. So in a lot of graph generation problems, you might have this distribution over, say, two community graphs, but the way the data actually looks is you're just given a set of adjacency matrices. So each training graph has an adjacency associated with it. And that's just this giant matrix where we put all of the nodes across the top and across this vertical column, as you can see on the bottom left here, and we just put a 1 for that entry if there's an edge from those two nodes connecting to each other in the graph, and a 0 if there isn't. So you can imagine that one way of solving the graph generation problem is to say, what if we had a set of node embeddings for each graph? So every node in the graph gets its own embedding, and we had some distance function that could reconstruct the adjacency matrix given these node embeddings. So it's sort of like you take this graph structure and you put it in like this high dimensional space and look at distances between the different nodes to figure out if they're connected or not. So if you had a set of such node embeddings, you could try and generate similar sets that look like your original training data. So in my talk, I'm going to answer two questions, which is how do we generate similar sets of node embeddings given some training data sets? And how do we actually, given just a bunch of adjacency matrices, find good node embeddings that can completely capture the structure of the graph just through the embeddings? So to answer the first question, I'm going to talk about this new model that we came up with, which is graph normalizing flows. But to get there, I'm going to take a bit of a detour and give a quick tutorial on normalizing flows and graph neural networks, which are two topics in machine learning that our work really builds heavily off of. So just to get a sense of how quickly I should go, how many of you here have heard of or are already pretty familiar with normalizing flows? Okay, and graph neural networks? Okay, cool. So let's start with normalizing flows. So there's a lot of math on this slide. I think it's probably going to be the mathiest slide, but the basic idea of a normalizing flow is that we're going to have a bunch of training data, and this training data in real-world applications, in real life, often has a very complicated distribution. It's not a distribution that you can easily sample from to get more data, and it's very difficult to capture this distribution. But there's this cool thing in statistics called the change of variables, which says that if you can find, which basically says you can find some function f that you can run on your training data, and that f will flow your training data to some space that we're going to call z. And this is a latent space. And the cool thing about z is that it's going to look a lot like a distribution that we can work with that's a lot easier to deal with, like a Gaussian. And basically, for the Gaussian, we already know its probability density function, so it's really easy to compute the probability of samples. And we also know how to draw samples from it so that we can generate things. So essentially, we're going to learn this function, which goes from our data to a Gaussian space at training time. And then if we want to basically generate more samples of our training data, we can sample from this latent space C, which is Gaussian, and then take this function and take the inverse and flow backwards into something that hopefully looks like it came from our training data. So I won't go into too many details, but you notice that I said we have to flow this thing backwards and take the inverse of our function. And it turns out that this is restrictive in the sense that it basically means that f has to be bijective. You need to be able to take its inverse. And there's a couple other restrictions having to do with the determinant of the Jacobian of f. And what this all boils down to is that designing f is actually a very interesting problem in machine learning that has been a pretty active area of research. And the particular formulation of normalizing flows that we focus on is called real NVP. And the way that they design f looks like this architecture above. So in their paper, they're trying to take distributions over images and generate more images that look like they came from that distribution. So they start by taking an image on the left and representing it as a real valued vector. So you just take all of the elements in the image and you just unfold them into this giant vector. And I won't go into too much detail, but basically what this architecture is doing is it's splitting that vector representing the image into two halves. So you see the blue and gray vectors on the left. And then it's running it through this architecture where at the end of the day, we're going to end up in this space on the right that looks like this giant vector basically gets transformed into something that looks Gaussian. And one really cool thing here is I said that this whole thing represents some function, right? And that function has all these restrictions on it. But if you look inside of this architecture, there are 4 circles that are pink and blue. Those 4 circles can be anything you want, even though this function is restricted. So because we're in the image domain, they use convolutional neural networks here. And once we get this function, once we're done training the network, we can then sample from the Gaussian space on the right here, run this whole thing backwards, and hopefully end up with more images of cute cats. So that's like a general overview of how normalizing flows work. The point is that you have complicated data, you're going to flow it to a distribution that you know something about, and that's going to help you do generation. So moving on to graph neural networks. The basic idea behind graph neural networks is that it is a type of architecture that makes learning on graph structured data easier because of certain inductive biases that it builds into the architecture. So let's say that we have this input graph on the left. And in this example, we're starting out with embedding vectors for the graph. So every single node gets its own embedding vector. That can be randomly generated, like say from Gaussian noise. It can be some property of the data set you have. Just for every reason, we have node embedding vectors. And now what we're going to do is we're going to run message passing steps. And a message passing step is like the central unit of computation in a graph neural network. So in the first message passing step, we'll focus as an example on this red node here. Basically, this red node is going to take in messages from all of its neighboring nodes shown in yellow, where the messages are the node embeddings of its neighbors. It's also going to take in a message from itself, which is just its own node embedding. And there's 2 main parts to a graph neural network. The first is the aggregation. So basically, if I'm the node, I'm going to look at all of these different embeddings and figure out some way to aggregate all of them. That can be like a sum function, or it can be like a much more complicated unit of computation. But however you want to do it, you basically come up with some aggregation of all of these different nodes. And then the second step is that you run that aggregation through a neural network, or an MLP. And what this is essentially doing is it's letting me figure out what is going on with the other nodes in the network. If I want to know like where exactly I am in space compared to my neighbors, this is going to let me figure that out based on the information that my neighbors send me. The other thing to note is that node updates are synchronous. So at the same time that this red node on the top is updating itself, the other node on the bottom row here on the left is also getting updates from its neighbors. And this just happens all at once in one message passing step. And if we keep running message passing steps, eventually all of the nodes in the network will have propagated their embedding to all of the other nodes in the network. And you can just keep doing this as many times as you want. And if you take the node representations, the node embeddings, at the end of a certain number of message passing steps, the hope is that those node embeddings are going to be a lot more useful and a lot more representative of what that graph structure is like and the relationships between its items, its nodes, than when you started out. And you can take those nodes and you can use them for downstream tasks. Okay, I am going super slowly, so I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. Basically, we combine these two big ideas in our paper, which is on graph normalizing flows. And so I told you before that we have these flows that can take data and transform them to Gaussians. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take sets of node embeddings and transform those sets such that they look like they were draws from a random from a multivariate Gaussian. And so this is what our architecture looks like, and it's pretty similar to the real MVP architecture I showed you earlier, but there are some key differences. The first one, like I said, is we're starting with an input where we have a bunch of node embeddings for all the nodes on the left side, and we basically make it look like it's Gaussian at the output. And then the second difference is that these four functions that I told you could be anything, now they're going to be graph neural networks. Because in order for me to take all of these node embeddings in some structured training data space and make them look Gaussian at the end of the day, I'm going to need those nodes to communicate with each other to figure out how to configure themselves correctly. And so we're going to introduce graph neural networks in each four of these circles. And now if we want to generate a graph, we basically can sample a set of Gaussian vectors from the right and flow this whole thing backwards to get a set of node embeddings that hopefully represents something that looks like a graph when we're done running a distance function over it. So the last thing that I haven't told you is how we actually get these node embeddings, because as I said earlier, for these data sets, we're just given adjacency matrices. And the way that we're going to do that is to use a graph autoencoder. So we basically start with some adjacency matrix on the left, and we have some encoder that's a graph neural network that basically runs message passing over all of the different edges in our training graph. And it can basically find a set of node embeddings after doing all these message passing steps, such that if we use a really simple distance-based decoder that just looks at, say, like Euclidean distances in this high-dimensional node embedding space, we can then reconstruct the original adjacency matrix. And this is a diagram of our full architecture. So on the right, you'll see the graph autoencoder that I just talked about. So we encode the adjacency matrices into some space X, where that X is a really good set of nodes, where those sets represent the different training graphs. And then we can take that X and move over to the left and train the graph normalizing flow that I told you about to basically take those sets into Gaussian vectors. And then at generation time, we can run that from the bottom up to get a generated set that we can then run through our decoder, which is the simple distance function. So we ran a bunch of experiments comparing our model to this baseline called graph RNN. Graph RNN is an autoregressive model that basically uses an RNN to decide at any given point whether or not to add a new node to the graph. And then once it adds a new node, it uses another RNN to decide which edges to add back to the existing nodes that it's already added. And so we experimented on two different data sets, one of these small 2 community graphs, and one of graphs that were actually drawn from like a real world social network. And so you can see some of the samples here. So the left is the training data, the right is graph RNN, which is our baseline. The middle is graph RNN, which is our baseline, and the right is graph normalizing flows, which is our model. So for ego, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between the models and the actual training data because they all are doing a pretty good job. And then these are the results for community. Again, training data on the left, graph RNN baseline in the middle, and us on the right. And so here our model is having a little bit more difficulty with like just spacing out the two communities correctly. So sometimes we get this like one giant connected community. And finally, we also ran some, I guess in generative modeling, it's like hard to get good quantitative evaluations of your models often, but you can basically, for the graph generation problem, run this script that looks at a bunch of different features of your graphs, like the degree or the orbit on the graph. And so we ran the script and found that our model is competitive with graph RNN, but as you can see with community small, we still need some work. So here, smaller is better. And in terms of future work, in the graph RNN paper, they ran their experiments on much larger graphs as well. So we're also working on that now to really test out how robust our model is. And you can also imagine that there are lots of other domains that have graphs, like in computer graphics, you have scene graphs, or you have like meshes that describe different objects. So one other thing that we're thinking would be cool is to apply this to those other domains. And if you're interested, here are a bunch of resources related to what I talked about. All right, thank you.
Jenny. All right, any questions?
Regarding getting the embeddings of the nodes and using the autoencoder, how does that network look like? Is it like typical autoencoder with one hidden layer and one output layer, or?
So you're talking about like this?
Yeah, this thing.
Yeah, so I guess like Encoder is a graph neural network. Mm-hmm. So we take like the input graph and then we just run a bunch of message passing steps. I think I probably forgot to mention like we start out with just like random Gaussian vectors. So like it's just really like noise at the start. And then like the graph neural network learns to transform that noise into like some set of embeddings that like when we run this decoder on it, it gets us the correct adjacency at the end.
And do you see any future perspective on interpretation of general neural networks? Because you can, I guess, can pretty much visualize complex neural networks, and there is a huge consensus that neural networks are not very well interpreted. Mm-hmm. So that can this work increase or better explain future neural networks and then decrease the general concern in public?
I mean, I guess like one thing you could maybe do is look at like in the intermediate message passing steps, like where do the node embeddings end up, and sort of figure out like what algorithm is it using to like correctly push this Gaussian noise into the right place. Like is it sort of like looking at like big picture structures first and then like pushing all of the like nodes within like each community, for instance, into the right place, or like I think if you just like look at the message passing steps, maybe that could be interpretable, but that's not something that we've looked at.
Yeah.
Thanks. Describe how the decoder loss works in this case.
Oh yeah, so it's actually just like a really simple. I can like show you afterwards, but it's just you take the like L2 distance between the two norms, and then you run it through like a sigmoid that's like flipped along the y-axis, and that basically like thresholds it to 1 or 0. And I guess we use some thresholding rule where like if it's above 0.5, then it's 1. And
very good question. Which brings me back to another one. So it seems like you're utilizing this kind of cycle GAN idea, which I like. But how do we ensure exactly that first of all, what is, when you say the intelligent distribution is Gaussian, how do you define it? Second of all, how do you ensure that that representation is Gaussian? Is that the premise of your GCN? Could you elaborate?
So I guess the thing that we're really trying to ensure is Gaussian is like this Z space at the end of the day looks like a set of like draws from a multivariate Gaussian. The way that we can ensure this is like it's sort of just it's like baked into the change of variables rule. Like that rule says that you can basically flow a complicated distribution to a Gaussian given some constraints on this function that you're using on your data distribution. So that's like basically just, it's like baked into our objective function, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So when you say affecting the objective, do you also receive loss for it, or?
I mean, I guess we're taking
Deterministic because you're sampling
like so the loss itself is ensuring that like we learn a function that correctly flows the data into a Gaussian.
Any other questions? All right, let's thank Jenny.